The painting here, as we begin our discussion of the Revolutionary Age, is a painting of the French storming of the Bastille. In the history of France, the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille, which occurred on July the 14th, 1789, is like the Independence Day for France. To this day, in France, July the 14th is celebrated in a way similar to the way that Americans celebrate July the 4th. The Revolutionary Age is a period of time that is very much a culmination of the thinking of the Enlightenment, the motivation that government should be representative to the will of the people, that nationalistic states in which the people's popular will is both recognized and in which the people are represented in a government. This is really a culmination of the Enlightenment, the thinking of individuals like John Locke, of Voltaire, of Montesquieu, and so forth. You probably date the Revolutionary Age best from 1776 to 1848, though in truth, in a way, we are still living in the Revolutionary Age because the idea of representative government remains the gold standard in the Western world for how governments should best be organized. Governments that respect people's natural rights, governments that respect human rights, governments that respect individual liberty, governments that are representative to the voice of the people, and have legal systems designed to provide humane treatment and justice that is at least attempting to be as fair as possible. So 1776, of course, would be the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the colonies in America, the origin of the United States. And of course, in France, the French Revolution began in 1789. Particularly in France and the Americas, these revolutionary ideas continued to shape both activities in Europe as well as in the Americas for at least half of the next century into the 1840s. And the reason why 1848 might be chosen as the culmination of the Revolutionary Age is because it was in 1848. This is why 1848 would be seen as like a culmination of this age, because in 1848 revolution spread across the European continent. Places like, for example, Germany, which was yet to be a truly unified nation state. There were movements in places like Frankfurt in Germany seeking to wrest German sort of independence from the influence of the Austrian royal house, the Austrian state, and create an independent German state that would be representative, a republic that would embrace capitalism and free trade and free market activity and so forth. So 1848 in ways was a culmination of the revolutionary impulse of the late 18th century. The revolutions of 1848 were largely not successful, and there were also revolutions during that very period of time in France itself, and France went through sort of a tumultuous aftermath of the French Revolution in which multiple republics and constitutions have been created since the French Revolution. But the French Revolution, again, this painting from the Bastille Day, and the artist is unknown, but this would have been a contemporary era painting. The storming of the Bastille in Paris on the 14th of July, 1789. The French Revolution was an incredibly transformative event in Western history. And while we might say that the revolution itself does not immediately end with sort of the long-term success of that particular government, it ingrained long-term those fundamental core principles of individual rights, of representative government, of the nation state, and so forth in France and in Western Europe. And that had long-reaching influence on Western civilization following this event. During the Revolutionary Age, we're looking at revolutions in the late 18th century and the 19th century that include not only the American Revolution, but also the successful Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. There are revolutions in South America, in places like Colombia, Venezuela. There are revolutions in Central America. There is a Mexican Revolution in the early 1800s. And all of these were generally motivated by these same impulses. In fact, the South American revolutionary Simón Bolívar was in many ways fashioned himself as almost like a George Washington of South America, very much seeking to apply some of the principles of the Revolutionary Age to the independence of the state that he envisioned to be Gran Colombia. Of course, this ultimately failed in the case of Bolivar, but the revolution was a success in terms of wresting itself from the influence of European monarchs. Revolutions generally come about because of hardship, generally associated with an abusive leadership, a leadership that is oppressive or abusive and unrepresentative of the popular will. Revolutions tend to emerge from within non-representative systems, dictatorships, monarchies, or within imperial territories which are ruled in a similar way. So that's kind of where the revolutionary impulse comes from. And of course, they don't always succeed, and oftentimes they fail. And when they fail, the perpetrators of revolution are often punished very harshly. And of course, as we see with the French Revolution, which very much succeeded in the short term and long term in terms of its influence, the French Revolution was a very bloody and violent affair in which it deteriorated into a state of mass terrorism and then gave rise to Napoleon Bonaparte, who then oversaw a military conquest of effectively all of Western Europe. So revolutions can be very risky and come with a great deal of consequences sometimes. The French Revolution, the American Revolution before it, really are, in the 18th century, though, the founding of the modern era. Their influence is profound. The twin revolutions of the 18th century, the American Revolution of the late 1770s, 1776 to 1783, maybe 1775 would be the proper way to date it, and of course the French Revolution, which begins in 1789, and of course continues until the rise of Napoleon in the latter 1790s, though Napoleon in his own respect was not inherently a repudiation of the revolution. He was a product of the revolution, and Napoleon, in fact, in many ways, even though he was an authoritarian figure, Napoleon in many ways carried the influence of the French Revolution across Western Europe and sowed the seeds for revolutionary thinking and revolutionary ideas for decades to come after his death. The Revolutionary Age is built on the principle of really eliminating monarchy. It's very much influenced by thinkers of the Enlightenment in this respect. And so destroying monarchy and replacing it with constitutional governments, parliamentary governments that are responsible to the will of the people, popular sovereignty, the sovereign rights of the people, the will of the people, is really at the core of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and generally the impulse of the Revolutionary Age. As I mentioned, revolutions in 1848 in places like Germany witnessed movements in places like Frankfurt, Germany, to try and create a representative government that embraced people's rights to free market trade and capitalism, as well as to protections of individual liberties and to representative government. This is a really important moment, too, because we're really talking about the birth of the modern nation state. And the nation state might be thought of as a large imagined community in which the individuals in the community define themselves through a sort of imagined understanding of what it means to be French, of Frenchness. They share certain symbols, they share certain values, they share certain civic principles. And so we see with this, too, the birth of the modern nation state. And in this sense, it is a very, very revolutionary moment and is very much the emergence of the modern world. As I mentioned, the critic might say, and scholars have argued about this from different perspectives, what in fact is revolutionary about these events? Because after all, the American Revolution only empowered white landowning males. The French Revolution led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. So in that respect, why should these be thought of as revolutionary? These were revolutionary events, and they're revolutionary primarily because of the long-term effect. So, first of all, they are experiments. They're experiments in self-government, representative Republican government. In the case of the United States, you're talking about the first successful revolution to break from a colonial power. They're ingrained around the principles, really, really revolutionary principles of natural rights. Like, for example, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we found in Thomas Jefferson's penning of the Declaration of Independence, which, of course, is borrowed from John Locke, famous Enlightenment philosopher, and we find similar principles in the French rights of man and citizen at the beginning of the French Revolution. It really marks an end of aristocracy, albeit in some cases maybe not immediate, but over the long term. The advent of a less rigid class system in which individuals can achieve upward mobility rather than the old medieval sort of organization of society around rigid class lines that were dictated largely by birth, with very few exceptions to that. You were either born into nobility, born into aristocracy, or you were born into an area of the peasantry or of the merchants class, or another skilled artisans class. Birth of nationalism, this imagined identity of group and place. In America, what it means to be American is accepting certain principles, of civic principles, of jurisprudence, of justice, of law, of the role of the people in their government, and so forth. Rights of individuals, similarly in France. So in this sense, the Pulitzer Prize winning author Gordon Wood, a famous author of the American Revolution, is right to say that while in the short term there are aspects of this that we would not see as revolutionary today, the fact that, for example, the American Revolution really only empowers white landowning males, the long term, these are profoundly important and revolutionary events, and in the short term they are as well. In fact, for example, the designation Mr. and Mrs., which became commonplace in the American colonies after the Revolution, was itself revolutionary. Before this period of time, those were terms that were really designated for the gentleman class. The aristocratic class were Misters and Misses. Well, after the Revolution, everyone begins taking these titles, and it was really a sign of an attempt to repudiate aristocracy, to repudiate birthright monarchy, birthright nobility, and so forth, and to open society away from the rigid class systems that used to dominate this period of time. So in that sense, I think the historian Gordon S. Wood is right to argue that this period of time, driven by the Enlightenment, driven by the Age of Reason, is indeed revolutionary, even if in the short term it might not be perceived as much by those of us today in the 21st century. Thomas Paine, just a couple more slides on this part of the PowerPoint. Thomas Paine, I wanted to mention, he's an incredibly significant figure during this period of time. Most in America, in the United States, would remember him for writing this famous Enlightenment-era pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he effectively argued that it was common sense for Americans to overthrow monarchy and replace it with a representative government. Likewise, Thomas Paine was actually involved fundamentally in the penning of the rights of man and citizen in the French Revolution. And of course, we see this sort of connection across the Atlantic of the French and the Americans in this. The French aligning with the United States in the American Revolution, individuals like Marquis de Lafayette fighting and working and learning in the American colonies, and likewise Lafayette returning, Thomas Paine going to France, and both of them together being fundamental in the creation of what was initially a parliamentary monarchy in 1789 at the outset of the French Revolution. Here is the famous signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is probably the most appropriate time to date the beginning of the Revolutionary Age. Washington, Paine, Hamilton, Adams, Franklin, the architects of the American Revolution, and in this sense, very much sort of leading the way and creating new Republican revolutionary states, representative states.